There
Doing
are,
great for it. Hopefully everybody else is as well.
can you turn your volume up a little bit, SR? It's really hard to hear you.
Let's get better, Colonel.
That's much better.
Okay, I had a set of headphones on. I turned them off.
Okay.
There.
So just to highlight a couple things before we get into the lesson. I know we all know what's going on as far as the continuation of Operation Gladio, but I was just watching a clip before we got started of Alex Jones talking to Tucker about the CIA flying planes into the buildings on 9/11, and Tulsi Gabbard saying that they found fraud in the voting machines. I want to make sure everybody understands that this is going to accelerate, and basically everything that we've spent the last 2 years kind of prepping everybody for, you guys are going to be at the front of the line in understanding all of the stuff that's soon to unfold. The people collectively in that sold their soul are melting down, and the more they melt down, it's going to be contagious. So very, very important to understand that. And so, and one of the funny things, I just posted this, is, do you remember back in 2000, the end of 15 into 16, how everybody goes, oh my gosh, I would love Trump except for the way he talked. If he would just talk like a normal politician. What they're seeing right now is that none of those quote unquote normal politicians talk that way for real. They act like what you see as veneer on the surface. They're all much worse talkers than Trump. And they're losing their collective mind right now. And you're going to see this more and more and more as they get closer to accountability. So I just want to make sure that we say that out loud, because they're going to collectively lose their mind. So, and I know it's kind of it's a bad thing to say, but I'm going to really enjoy it. I'm going to enjoy especially the ones that are senior officers in the military that sold their soul, like Don Bacon. Don Bacon inside of the military was a horrible, horrible person. And there are some general officers that have a, they're not all that great. They're not all that bad. They're just kind of blah. There's some that people absolutely despise. He's one of those. And unfortunately for Nebraska, they elected him to office. And he made the stupidest mistake anybody could make in taking Laura Loomer on. And he got into a pissing contest with her, which you can't refute her facts. So he just started calling her names, kind of like Kyle Seraphin. When you can't refute facts, you just call people names. These are the same people that 8 years ago was complaining about Trump and the way he talked. And so again, enjoy this acceleration into accountability, because it's going to be delightful for those of us who understand what's going on. Okay, so to the lesson, number 3 in the book, Transnational, Anti-Communism and the Cold War. We're going to talk a little bit today about those, one of the quote unquote neutral countries that we were told, was neutral, Switzerland. Switzerland had a very active trade union going on. And you would think, being neutral, that it wouldn't be involved in any of the shenanigans of NATO or um, actively embracing Nazism or any of these other things. You'd be wrong if you thought that, but that's what you would think. So, there's been plenty of research that has been conducted by state private networks and the political, trade union, and cultural circles in Europe. But Switzerland has largely gone unnoticed because, again, nobody would think to look there for any of these left, right, or any of these other things that goes on because, again, it was neutral. Well, they had a guy that was a trade unionist in Geneva by the name of Lucien, Lucien. And I'm going to spell his last name, and then I'm going to tell you how I'm going to pronounce it today because I don't know how to actually pronounce it. I tried doing the whole Google thing on pronunciation, and it came up with like 5 different things. It's spelled Tronchet. So I'm going to pronounce that Tronchet. I don't know if that's right or not. The leader of the Federation of Wood and Construction Workers. That's what he did. So when these private entities that were going to focus on the union, like we talked about yesterday, was looking around in Switzerland, they set their eyes on this guy here. He was very well known because he was a World War II hero. And he was intimately involved in unions. So the image of a trade unionist of direct action, the anti-fascist who took part in the Spanish Civil War. He was also part of the French Resistance. He was a militant worker that people viewed had impeccable integrity. He also had joined the Construction Workers Action League. He had no hesitation in being militant in relationship to his union duties, such as occupying building sites, and actually creating violence when necessary against employers. This image of the shock syndicalist overshadowed the truth about what he was really all about. He would engage in international movement of trade unions and was ready to mix the interest of capitalism, i.e., the American government, and state surveillance in support of political police. Research into the years during which he was very active showed a complete and convincing link between the Europeans and the US in controlling and manipulating labor movements. It became complex when you looked at their integration into social and cultural dimensions of the countries that they were involved in. They also had an early focus on social justice. They preferred routes in keeping with his commitment to individual autonomy, but with more focus on collective social justice. He had already opposed the Bolsheviks in the name of an independent trade union. He had condemned the October Revolution, saying, quote, any organization of political power that proclaims itself provisional and revolutionary can only be a deception because Lenin's coup can only be can only ever signify the beginning of a counter revolution. But how does this champion of insubordination come to be caught up in Cold War propaganda? The irony of history is that the first mention of Cronche in the American archives relates to the fact that in September 1950, perhaps in hopes of harming an enemy like the Soviet Union, the CIA representative in Bern, James Kronthal, Kronthal, who himself was a Soviet agent, categorized him as a communist. And yet, as a member of the Socialist Party from 1949 and leader of the Geneva section of the FOBB, he was crossing swords more than ever with the communists. And again, this could, in fact, be just replicative of the control both sides narrative. A Union Congress was held in which he argued resolutely against the communist position. This Congress constituted an early step for him on a route towards the U.S. and his involvement with the CIA. Indeed, his speech was closely followed by Pat Frayne, Frayne, from the Economic Cooperation Administration in Paris, who had earlier visited this guy in Geneva. He was a labor attaché from the U.S. legation in Bern and took part in the debates. Another guy that was also serving in that role, or I guess that's a woman, was Harriet Harling Lothrop, Lothrop, who was later to become Tronche's mistress. Now, Harriet is going to play a big role in she basically is serving as his handler. That's what I would characterize it. He then marries her after he divorces his first wife. Pat Frayne, who had inquired about the results of the Congress, was told by Tronche, generally the Congress was a good display of worker maturity. Despite the use of certain delaying maneuvers from the communists, the Swiss Trade Union Confederation, the biggest union federation in Switzerland, had shown great skill in proposing a call for membership of the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. It was an organization that had been created in 1949 in order to, quote unquote, hold the communist influence in check, as part of the organization we learned about yesterday called the World Federation of Trade Unions, WFTU. From that point on, relationships between the administrators of the Marshall Plan in Paris and Tronche would intensify. Tronche kept himself regularly fed with documentation on American economics and union updates. Once he called for a publication that had been produced in the American Embassy in Rome in memory of an Italian martyred worker to be distributed among Italian immigrants that were seasonal workers in Switzerland. At the time, the leadership of the Swiss trade unions were doing everything they could to lessen the impact of, quote unquote, communism among the foreign workers. And again, they're referring to communism in a form of workers' rights. They want to basically monopolize the arena of unions so that they don't actually represent the workers. They represent the businesses under the disguise of representing the workers. He also worked very closely with the Swiss federal police. At the same time as these exchanges with American representatives, a project came about to invite Swiss trade unionists for a study trip to the United States. It was not clear who first proposed this, But in November 1950, Harriet Lothrop, his mistress, wrote to Tranche, and this is a quote from her letter, regarding the voyage of Swiss Unionists to the U.S. I am happy to tell you that I am able to propose some names for this voyage. As you know, it is important to choose the people who, when recounting their personal impressions, will draw the greatest number of listeners. The American attaché also wrote to specify that it would be necessary to speak English and not have a controversial political past, i.e., you can't bring any of your Nazi friends. She goes on to say, not entirely without shame, I would remind you that because all of the recent American legislation in matters of security, it is preferable to find someone who has never been a member of the Communist Party. I leave you complete freedom to suggest one or two from Geneva while indicating the reasons for your choice. But at the same time, do tell me if you would be able or willing to take part in the program as well. I would very much like to propose you, and you would be able to learn some elements of English. The personal note from Harriet and the ultimate aim of the mission was evident. The notes for an act of rapprochement at worker level between the US and Switzerland that Strange had delivered to the US legation in Bern leaves no doubt that the trade unionist enthusiasm and support for an operation commingled with the United States. Cronje underlined the need to better acquaint the Swiss worker with the Marshall Plan and the realities of America. Another quote, the men would be chosen from among the best militant workers, as judged by their comrades, on the ground of their sense of responsibility, their objectivity, their unshaken attachment to the ideas, and their opposition to totalitarian concepts, except for where they're in charge of them. And no doubt they would be listened to on their return. These men who know how to speak and write of world workers would be a great service. And it goes on, but understand that at the end of the day, the only person that went on this trip was Tranze himself. He didn't bring any of his workers, just him. He came to the United States in 1951. He came in June. He stayed till October. And he was there under the tutelage of the State Department's program called Foreign Leader Program. He was one of the only ones from Switzerland that participated in this program. And for the 4 months that he was here, which was in the middle of the McCarthy era and at the height of the Korean War, it constituted the second and most important knot around his links to Americans. It also helped him organize himself and his thoughts as to exactly how he was going to operate his union when he returned. So the CIA and the State Department lent its support at an administrative level, suggesting names of people for him to meet. In other words, they set up his itinerary. His diary pays testimony to many meetings that he had, mostly with union work leadership, but also with entrepreneurs, industrialists, journalists, senior civil servants, diplomats. In other words, he was getting indoctrinated into being an operative for the United States in Switzerland. He met with people like William Green, Victor Reuther, and Michael Ross, and made contact with two of the most ardent Cold War warriors of international syndicate, and they actually use that word, namely J. Lovestone and Irving Brown, who we've already talked about. And just as a reminder, those were the representatives of the AFL. The latter pair immediately got on well with him, and they were quick to put to good use his documentation on the disappearance of two Swiss in the Soviet Union, a guy by the name of Mark Schalks and Yvonne Bovard, Bovard. While he was at it, Brother Tranche, as he was called according to the customs of American Unionists, was able to deliver a speech at the annual Congress of AFL, as well as a Congress of the CIO. In Denver, the union members of the CIO gave him a standing ovation. He wrote in his diary that he was asked for autographs. This led him to participate in several demonstrations for a movement called moral rearmament. This Protestant-inspired movement, founded in Oxford, like the Rhodes Oxford, by an American by the name of Frank Buchman, Buchman, in 1938, had its headquarters in Switzerland after the war. Tranche had come in contact with them several years ago, around 1948. He organized a presentation for them called The Forgotten Factor for young union members. In San Francisco, he attended another edifying spectacle typical of moral rearmament. It was a theater play. He even went to Mackinac Island, where the American branch of moral rearmament was based. He delivered a lecture at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which basically is a CIA front, and was able to express himself on Voice of America, which is another CIA front. So, responding to questions that he had, how did he have the luxury of doing this? It all seems to have happened at the invitation of none other than Allen Dulles, who at the time was the deputy director of plans, which is their covert operations, i.e. Operation Gladio. During his stay, he wrote up reports that eventually appeared in multiple European and American publications, but they were mass circulated in Switzerland. He continued to recount his experience with articles, conference, films, exhibitions, and distribution of brochures at a pace that made it seem like they weren't coming from him at all. When he returned, they were distributed to Swiss workers, and also a copy of Irving Brown's book called European and American Unions United by the Marshall Plan. They're really, really, really pushing the Marshall Plan. And people should ask why. All of this was distributed by none other than the U.S. Information Agency, which again is another CIA front. He showed films when he returned. Most of them were funded by the 20th Century Fund and USIA, which is a CIA front. So in 3 months, he had given over 27 lectures. He basically was making an appeal to donate to his International Center for Union Training in Geneva. It was created by the Swiss in connection with the FOBB before he had departed for the United States. Many people believe that, and I've read this in multiple places, that he basically was the head Operation Gladio guy and that they were using trade union membership for recruitment of covert Gladio cells. Just so that you guys get that. Because the overlap of his handlers all being associated with the CIA and his kit glove treatment of coming over, doing his indoctrination in the United States, and having all of this documentation produced for him, which basically amounts to propaganda, and then him going back having all of this propaganda to then use inside of Switzerland, and his association with the national police, which is mentioned in here repeatedly. But if you start doing research into this guy, this starts shaping up looking exactly like what they did in Latin America, minus the violence. Like disappearing people and torturing them. Not that I don't know that they did that or didn't do that in Switzerland, but the same apparatus is being set up using the national police, and having someone, in this case, through the trade unions, orchestrate all of it. And it's the perfect guise in a place where you're supposedly neutral to use a union to do that. All right. Irving Brown, the representative in Europe for AFL in the Free Trade Union Committee, what and his association, which we've already covered with the CIA, was well known. With Joseph Keenan, Keenan, in office in the headquarters in AFL Washington, Brown was the man through whom money from AFL was sent to Office of Policy Coordination and then the CIA. The Office of Policy Coordination, is an entity that comes up several times, especially back in the early days of Operation Gladio, as a conduit for funding. So then it left the CIA and went to Geneva. The size of the sum of money was unknown. Moreover, on many occasions, Brown personally played a part on courses in the role of conference speaker and made available his entire network, and often used the venue of the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which again is CIA, and was associated with a guy by the name of Michael Josselson, Josselson. The relationship between Tranche and Brown was not a passing one. It transformed into a friendship that lasted until the 80s, some 35, 40 years later. The fourth episode is another trip. In the summer of 1953, Tranche was sent to Indochina as part of a trade union excursion. Officially, this happened right at the conclusion of the Korean War. He was sent there to study conditions in a country that was still under French rule, meaning Vietnam. In reality, it was to work towards a reunification of the French and the Vietnamese unions into a single federation that they had hoped to use to undermine Ho Chi Minh. The facts finding and information gathering mission lasted 1 month. He did not ease up his efforts and was showing his political skill in negotiations, although the so-called unification unionization was a failure. Okay. He also worked in Europe with the CIO, the AFL, and a thing called the Mutual Security Agency, which again had its tentacles into the CIA, and he was forwarding Alan Dulles, as he was working with these entities, reports. With Indochina, Tranche was to embark on his Third World tact. At the start of the 1960s, he then turned to Africa. And he focused on primarily French colonies. He took part in efforts in Tanzania, Algeria, Morocco, and Congo, which is Belgium. But every one of those were involved in an Operation Gladio, by the way. So you start to see basically everything this guy touches in preparation ends up being a coup. And he does it under the guise of going as a union representative to do stuff for the people. But he's not doing anything for the people. As rapprochement first needs to be placed in its general context, its emergence effectively coincided with the moment when American Battle for Hearts and Minds began to form. In 1947 and 48 onward, with the aim of countering similar efforts already tried and tested by the Soviets, the American government, following the lead of the CIA, put in place a doctrine and instruments specifically aimed at particular groups around the world, namely youth, students, intellectuals, lawyers, and unions. The Tranche case is part of a psychological warfare offensive combined with two other strands: a labor policy that accompanied the Marshall Plan in Europe, and cultural diplomacy that was intended to promote the American way of life around the world. You know, everybody wanted to be like America. The agencies involved were the Department of State, the Department of Labor, Mutual Security Agency, U.S. Information Agency, the CIA, and the unions, AFL and CIO. On the American side, everyone had their reasons for turning to Tranche to use him as a representative. They saw him as influential. He had inroads into France and Italy. He had, because of his World War II fame, he had recognizable authority, and he basically had, his tentacles into many kinds of socialist, quasi-communist activities, all while saying that he was anti-communist. As for the socialist part, in 1953, the American Council in Geneva judged that Tranche is, they declared he was no more socialist or left wing than any other European labor union movement, which means he's not necessarily, he is not necessarily not a communist. He's just, if he is, he's as much a communist as everybody else. I love the way they use their words. It says Tranche has a reputation of being only nominally a socialist, an opinion no doubt shared by the cultural attaché in Bern, who 2 years earlier had arrived at the conclusion that Tranche, quote, would have to be associated with our anti-communist activities in Europe, unquote, meaning Gladio. Modest in scope, the U.S. cultural diplomacy programs towards Switzerland were focused on Tranche's services. The strategy for this country, as defined by the competent bodies, the U.S. International Information and Exchange Program until 1953, it later became the U.S. Information Agency, again a CIA front, effectively banked on useful personal contacts rather than blind mass propaganda, targeted propaganda. 1950, the cultural attaché in Bern called for an up-to-date technique for a psychological strategy to be applied to Switzerland. If possible, each front organization, and they named them, unions, press, intellectuals, peasants, women, and students, needed to be represented by intermediaries, small in number but reliable and effective, who would themselves take initiative for cooperation with the US, i.e., CIA. Switzerland was given the function of a springboard to a much wider world in France, Italy, and Germany, because number one, they're geographically close, but number two, They had autonomy of traveling around Europe that no one else had because of their quote unquote neutral status. And what's the irony of all ironies here is you have to have known this, because we have spent the last 2 years telling you every fucking time a country says they want to be neutral, they're attacked, their leader is killed, their government is overthrown, and people are disappeared. You are not allowed to be a neutralist. And yet Switzerland and Sweden were neutralist. But they couldn't have really been neutralist, or their country would have been destroyed. So you know, in fact, in your head, if you think about it 5 seconds, they were never neutral. But we don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. All right. And they just go on to make the point that they used immigrants that were in Switzerland to cultivate them to be liaisons with their home countries, because they're Swiss citizens and they're neutral, but they were in fact learning how to be spies. Okay. They became opinion leaders since the Swiss press enjoyed a reputation, again, as being neutral. So the CIA planted stories there all the time. This is a quote from one of Transnational's foreign leader grants publications. Switzerland is strategically placed in Europe, both geographically and ideological, for American use in the propaganda war. There is the assumption implicit that Switzerland will play much of the same part internationally in the future international relations with Europe as she did during World War II. There is the second assumption that the US will wish to develop phases of the propaganda war and initiate the programs more closely with that of the CIA and move the information side of the program towards political activation. The AFL shared most of these motives in encouraging Tranche to play a lead role. At the same time, the Swiss tradition, somewhat of a myth, of being built on the principle of a collective contract and agreement on employment, was a notion that the AFL found seductive. There was an appreciation that Tranche's pragmatic attitude and organizational capabilities provided America with a tool that they intended to use. Brown considered him one of his own. Lovestone trusted him and others like Harry Goldberg, who they knew they could depend on. Everything indicates that the Americans were part of this, but the lead person was this Harriet Lothrop. And the role that she played, it is clear that Tranche was not caught up in some sort of trap. He was a willing participant. He was investigating all possible means for establishing contact. So it was a mutual beneficial relationship, all focused around promotion of the Marshall Plan. Tranche's stance irritated his brother, who was responsible for publishing him in Switzerland. His brother owned the press. And this is a quote: "Your articles stink too much like propaganda." This is his brother telling him that. "And not enough like information. Be careful. You're too deeply involved, and you might not realize that your readers want to be informed and not doped." Or duped, I think is the word they were looking for. The best propaganda here in Switzerland is it not a question of saying purely and simply what you can, but you need nuance that you judge to be useful. Your articles give the impression that you are completely caught up in the mood and you're forgetting the Swiss spirit in mentality. So he was so dripping with sucking up to the US that his brother's going, dude, you're losing your mind here and you're going to lose your audience. He didn't seem at all concerned. His response was, if the propaganda is done well, my lectures about the US are very well attended. So, in other words, he didn't care. Despite his favorable reactions from the Department of Labor and the Carnegie Endowment, a book that he wrote was never produced, but he was paid for it. That's probably a form of money laundering. Politically, Tranzé admired the functioning and the political punch of the American unions. He subscribed completely to the idea that productivity would be increased as a result of better cooperation between owners and workers. He just wanted himself to be the go-between. Here's something that he said to his audience in a speech. In the USA, I learned much about your research services, the education of workers, the theories of productivity. Since my return, therefore, I pay particular attention to these issues around our union organization and authorities. So basically, he's just, again, he's a tool of the US. Tranzé understood the full extent to which he could take advantage of the alliance and opposing and using the anti-communists to his advantage. In a speech, he said, quote, I spoke as neither a beggar or a sycophant. I believe that this is good work on behalf of Europe, unquote. He also was fanatical in his belief and holding up of America as the icon in which to duplicate. Another speech that he gave said this: the fact remains that the social conditions, such as they exist in the US, are the best and the most equitable known in the world. In the US, we did not only see the oft repeated demonstration of industrial power, but we saw above all a people grateful and attached to the country, which ensures them the development of a social life of well being and liberty. Until we didn't have it anymore. And it was all given away by our leadership. As for Tranzé, he enjoyed driving around in an American car and dressing up as a cowboy while he was out with his mistress, soon to be wife. Okay, one last thing. As the determined defender of the US, in a face-to-face conversation with one of the chiefs of the CIA at the height of the McCarthy era, his fairly radical ideological turnaround in favor of the Union and his deep-rooted rejection of communism pushed him, thanks to the Cold War, along a new route to give his stamp of approval on the unification of the Atlantic body, basically NATO. He was an informed and crafty man he could not have been, as a result, he could not have been duped into playing a game. He was pulled into a soft power machinery of America and the CIA. It goes on to say that Tranzé's actions did not pass unnoticed internationally. Indeed, when updated on the Swiss man's efforts in the cause of free unionization in Africa, the U.S. ambassador at the Organization of European Economic Cooperation proposed, with the agreement of Irving Brown and J. Lovestone, that a Swiss should be named as an assistant secretary general of the organization in 1961. And I'm sure they did a by name request for him since he was such a pliable guy that they absolutely loved. That's the end of that chapter. I don't want to start the new one because it is fairly long. We will go over that one tomorrow and we can open it up.
I was just throwing Stella. Stella's in the house. Stella and Warhamster, the mic.
Yeah, Warhamster had dental work today. He may not want to talk. He may just be here to listen. That's the reason why we didn't do our secret societies today.
Right.
SR71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. As we're talking about Switzerland today, it just occurred to me why Switzerland, even though we know they're not neutral, absolutely got into some of this stuff. Everybody looks at Switzerland as the banking institution in Europe. And that's my guess concerning the Marshall Plan and what was going on. That's where some of that money was going to wind up big time. That just doesn't escape my mind.
Well, they definitely are home to many of the financial instruments that were created after World War II. But again, they were set up there under the guise that they were quote unquote neutral. And I want everyone, at least in their brain, to begin thinking about the fact that they were never neutral. They weren't allowed to be neutral. No one was allowed to be neutral. You had to be for America or you were against America. And if you were against America, your regime got changed. And so people need to be aware of just collectively that we've talked about Sweden a lot and the fact that they hid all of the German patents there. They were never neutral. They funded both sides of every war. They've been aggressively very war hawkish. They're one of the leading suppliers of war material. They are also they own the underpinnings of every communication around the world. They did that under the guise of being neutral, but it actually provided them with a power that's almost unsurpassed by any other country because they dominate the ability to collect intelligence because of their monopolization of telecommunications. They are not neutral. As a matter of fact, they would be the number one blackmailer of anybody because they have all of the information. They have more information than NSA. So they're not neutral, either one of them. Okay, so we have someone over on Rumble said when the CIA recruited in Eastern Europe, the recruit had to set up a bank account at a Swiss bank, which makes perfect sense because we also established the fact that all of the leaders that were installed after governments were couped, in order to be paid their share of the take, had to set up an account at BCCI. Even George Bush Senior had an account at BCCI. Saddam Hussein did. Noriega did. Every one of them had a bank account at BCCI. That's how they were able to money launder for them. So that makes perfect sense. And thank you for adding that. All right. Illini, did you have something? I don't see anybody's hands.
Hey, Colonel. Yeah, I had a comment on the overall geopolitical economy going on right now and how that's kind of interacting with your comments at the very beginning of this.
Sure, go ahead.
There's kind of an interesting situation that's been happening in the Treasury market lately with at least it kind of looks like somebody from Asia selling off U.S. Treasuries in the overnight market, which could kind of be a signal that, what the Austrian economics crowd and the people who weren't Keynesians and everybody, there was all these people immediately after 2008 who said, don't worry, we can print lots of money and stimulate the economy. And there were a bunch of conservative Republicans out there who basically said, hey guys, there's, some knock-on effects of doing all of this. We may have to pay the piper one day. And there's a possibility that, I don't necessarily know if it's, exactly which foreigners it is, but somebody is selling U.S. bonds, and that may ultimately kind of be coinciding with what's going on with Tulsi Gabbard's comments, the Ruth filing, with Ukraine, and as we're doing all of this, it does seem to kind of be having an effect on U.S. soft power in the whole process. So we have a trade deficit. If anybody out there is good listening to this, is good at robotics, or if they have a lot of precious metals, number one, it might be time to hang on, to not necessarily sell them so quickly. And number two, if anybody's good at the manufacturing process, this is probably the time for us to step up and try to balance the trade deficit.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be lots of need for that. I absolutely agree with you. Which then goes to commercial real estate as well, because I think what you're going to find, obviously, we had a glut of commercial real estate and the housing market was restricted because you had, I don't know, 50 million illegals here. Now the illegals are getting kicked out. So the housing market should stabilize, if not be a whole lot cheaper, where commercial property is going to be much more valuable, you would think, if we're going back to being a manufacturing base, because those facilities have to be set up in commercial real estate. And so it is going to be very interesting to watch. Go ahead, Stellar.
I was also going to say Switzerland neutral, bah humbug. And Basel, think about it. The Basel Accords, that's a city in Switzerland, and that's the banking of international settlements. Those are their rules. So it just kind of, makes you think, Switzerland is not at all, it seems like there's a lot of strings that are behind the curtains that are pulled out there. And I think it's wonderful that, and I think that China is probably selling a lot of their bonds and stuff like that, because the yuan has dropped in value so much that they're selling it, and hopefully they're using, the money, US dollars, for whatever, rather than using it to buy gold. So I think it's great. And then I believe, didn't Trump just put another tariff on top of China? The other countries are, accepting it, just trying to make it an equal level playing ground, because China, since they've been in, like the West markets and stuff like that, they've never, straight, and they can inflate their value of their money. They can deflate it at, a wink of an eye, because of how their systems are all set up. And don't forget, a couple of years ago, a lot of the companies where the Chinese people were working, they raided their retirements. And that was just a couple of years ago. So we can't forget that, so, yeah.
Illini, go ahead.
I'm going to push back on a little bit of that. If China is selling the 10-year bond, and we're at 4.5%, and we've got a $36 trillion if we have $36 trillion in debt, and $9 trillion of that is refinancing in the next year, it sets us up for budget problems. And it potentially sets us up for balance of payments issues too, if a lot of that debt is held internationally. What's probably going to have to happen is the Fed is probably going to have to hold off on quantitative tightening, but then I don't necessarily know what that does for the value of the dollar or its purchasing power.
Yep. Stellar, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, I do believe that they do hold a lot of our bonds, and it's really crappy that we let internationals hold. I know that that's part of like how the world goes round and round, but when any country has that much power over another country just because they own bonds and stuff, there's an issue. And don't forget Japan also, which is a beta test of fiat stuff, because their economy, and their what they're going through as well is terrible, and it's because, they're being told to keep propping up the dollar and things. But I do believe that a lot of these countries are selling these 10 years, and it did come down to 3.8, and then people just bought it back up because the dollar is still strong, even though it's manipulated and things. But I think that, the more that, China sells and their yuan goes down, but again, they manipulate because their government and their monetary system set up that way that they could do whatever, but as things are getting adjusted and things, I think it's a wonderful thing, and let their yuan. I mean, unfortunately, other countries will probably go there to get, whether it's to get married or vacations and stuff like that, because the yuan is weak compared to the dollar. If you see the people coming into the United States, because our dollar is still strong compared to the euro, and especially the Australian dollar, even the Canadian dollar, it's just too expensive for them to come here. So in some respects, it's because the dollar is strong, but in some respects, it's really bad that it's strong, if that makes any sense.
So I'll wind this up in a way that kind of turns us back to Operation Gladio, which is, you can see, like, at the very least, you can see how where we agree, Stella, is that it may not necessarily be a good idea for foreigners to own our bonds because that gives them more influence over us. And the same thing is going on with real estate and equities and everything else. And that gives them a foothold to try to do political influence operations, and also an interest in doing those political influence operations in the United States, along with our trade deficit. So there is this big picture interaction here with the Operation Gladio model, and the deep politics and the or quote unquote U.S. soft power, which is obviously sometimes exercised somewhat corruptly, but there is that interaction there, and all of this exposure is happening. It's worth thinking about that.
I agree. Southern, go ahead.
I just had a general question about China. They have 21% unemployment. They've eroded the middle class, and I do remember, Stella, the run on the banks. They couldn't get their money out. I was on a call. We had to work with China during COVID, and so we're on the call with the top medical guy and our guy from Turkey that had 120 factories running for gloves and things. They had that Evergrande, that real estate company and property management. China just let them fall because they don't care about entrepreneurs and business. They don't care. But that was a massive slide during PPE, and people couldn't get their money out of the country, couldn't get the raw materials out, because everything that was under that company, they just shut it down. And we're talking over 100,000 factories were shut down. With this high unemployment, they don't have enough babies. How are they going to get out of this? They're going to have to sell their way out. I don't know how China's going to respond. They're not in a good position. Everybody keeps talking about great China. I'm like, that's a huge unemployment. And the yuan obviously cratered, but they also have been manipulating that for years to win. But the bottom line is nobody's ever had a fair trade deal with China. So this is kind of go for the gusto and see what happens. But I don't know what the crystal ball on this one is, on how this will turn out. What do you guys think?
Let me go to Alfred next.
Hey, Colonel.
Hi.
Yeah, I just want to point out, so these criminals have been controlling the debt-based money, since 1971, but controlling the money through the Federal Reserve or any of these central banks. It's really just one central bank, in my opinion, that basically takes orders of what the Bank of International Settlements. But, none of these numbers can be legitimate when they're finding, 14 computers that have been running for 12 years that don't have any accounting. So they're pumping how many billions of dollars into the system that aren't being accounted for. So realize everything is based and valued in dollars. And the underlying numbers of those dollars are fraudulent. I mean, I think this is going to start coming out. I could be wrong. I could be wrong about all this, but this is what it seems like to me. Like, it strikes me as, here's this rug that they got, and they're pumping money into it, creating it. I mean, we're literally talking about the biggest criminals on the planet running the monetary system. I don't think that's far-fetched or far from the truth. So I really question any of their numbers at this point. And to say the dollar is strong, I think that's an illusion. I think the whole thing is an illusion. And I'm really wondering, how that reality is going to start setting back into the real world.
When the hologram is going to be turned off?
Exactly. I mean, I don't have any special information or knowledge. I'm just kind of going by what Doge is saying. But yeah, 14 computers running for 12 years with no accounting. Just paying bills. I would assume billions of dollars. Who knows how many dollars they've pumped into the system?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably
I have a
closer
comment on
to
that, but I think Warhamster might have a better one.
I try to point that out. Okay, so we forget that sometimes,
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, that's good.
Guys. Thank you.
Sure.
So I worked at Lehman in 2008, and I remember when they passed TARP and how everybody was shocked at all the money printing that was going to happen because of that. But what happened in the process, though, in the process of bailing out all the other banks, was the funds basically got sanitized because they went off to hedge funds and very wealthy investors who didn't really spend the money; they invested it instead. So all the predictions that there were a lot of predictions back then that gold and silver were going to rally, that we might have, inflation or, currency issues, that never materialized. But what's happening now, because of these potential trade barriers and stuff like that, it's encouraging people, to take some of their money out of the country if they're foreign. And that, could cause, some of the currency and precious metals issues that had been predicted, 17 years ago, I guess.
Warhamster, did you have something you wanted to say? I noticed he came back up as speaker. While we're waiting on him, SR71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. In a way, I'm listening to what Alfred said. It was something that crossed my mind earlier as well. If I take a look at what just happened with the markets and everything else, to me, it was a clear signal from Trump, I can bring down the whole kit and caboodle. End of story. Is that where we really want to go? And it scared the hell out of people. And that's what I'm looking at now. So seeing that as the backdrop, the question now is whether or not Trump is going to get people to respond in a responsible manner. That's where I'm looking at this. Thank you.
Sure. Stellar, go ahead.
Colonel, can I?
Go ahead, Warhamster. Go ahead.
Yeah, because there's a number of things dropped, and I need to go back a bit. First of all, Illinois is quite right. There was big movement in the treasury markets in Asia. There was a couple of other factors going on with the bond volatility. We had the bond vigilantes, and anyone who knows our market history realizes that the bond vigilantes are a bunch of, it's called hedge funds, et cetera, that are able to sell off their bonds to manipulate government action. That was definitely at work. But the other thing to remember is with all the volatility in the equity markets and commodities and currencies over the last 5-6 trading days, you had margin calls all over the place. Well, the treasury market is the most liquid security in the world. It's also used to facilitate most international trade. That's set up there intentionally. Trump's move yesterday, he basically he had the bond vigilantes saying, we don't like this uncertainty. And that's one reason You saw the market react so positively when Trump paused a lot of the tariffs. But China is under the gun right here. He's actually turned the world to be anti-China. They don't have the power because they hold our debt of influencing us in any way, shape, or form because they can't dump the debt. It hurts them more than it hurts us. And if you're going to sell bonds, you have to sell it to somebody else. Obviously, that impacts interest rates. Higher, when bonds drop in value, interest rates go up. Higher interest rates drive your currency higher. That punishes your exporters and helps your importers. That's all going on. But I think the big picture thing that, and the reason I think it's going to continue to be volatile, is these actions by Trump have a chance to reset the entire American rules-based financial order that was set up in Bretton Woods in 1944. We saw it again with the GATT and all the other different trade deals, NAFTA, GATT, trilateral, all those agreements. They are being unwound because of Trump's tariff policy. Because it's, as was always said, with the post-Marshall Plan, the United States volunteered to be the world's piggy bank. Money is debt. We've created the debt. That's why we have a $30-something trillion debt. That's the system. What this tariff system is doing is unwinding all of not only the trade tariffs, but all the other side agreements, all the carve-outs that have been done with trade deals, the ISDS, the World Trade Organization, all that stuff that's being unwound. Now, that's 7 or 8 decades worth of bureaucratic systems that are in play.
Did we lose him?
I lost Warhamster.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Warhamster.
No, some idiot called. Someone called in on my phone. I'm
okay.
Dead, but I'm just going to close up and say, because I can't, it really does, my mouth really does hurt. So this is painful, but it's too important of a topic. And Elena brought up some really good points. And I think so did Stellar. You're not going to see the headline reasons for what's going on. That's not really what's going on. There's a lot deeper movement going on here. And these 90-day window for these other countries to come in from the cold and actually negotiate fair trade. The free trade is a joke. It doesn't exist. It always comes with carve-outs and side deals. We want what's called free and fair trade. And that's kind of closer to the laissez-faire of the original intent. But that's something Trump has talked about for a long time. Fair deals that benefit both sides. Unfortunately, this is more than just ripping off a Band-Aid. It's completely changing the course of the biggest economic engine in the history of mankind. And it's not going to come without some pain.
Right.
So ignore headlines, ignore the volatility. Quality will always be the best investment. And I do not think, don't worry. China doesn't have the leverage here. We can go through a litany of reasons. And some of the speakers have already mentioned their demographic problem. They accumulated more debt in 10 years than the United States did in 100. Their entire civilian population, their savings are in the form of paper investments into real estate, buildings that nobody's ever lived in. It is a Ponzi scheme. That's why you get these cities, bridges built to nowhere and ghost cities. And people invest in those. That's like it's a 401k. They don't have equity investments, and they don't own land. They own apartment buildings where nobody lives. It is not they are vulnerable in so many different ways. And I can go off on China for another 10 minutes, but I don't want to. I'm kind of making points.
We don't want you to be in too much pain. You've got to get better for tomorrow.
All right. Well, I'll leave it there then. And great comments, everybody. I felt compelled to suffer through the agony and share a couple of thoughts on that.
No,
we thank you for doing that, Warhamster.
Yeah, I'm very glad you did, Warhamster. Obviously, your experience is valued here a lot. So thank you. Ron, go ahead.
I just wanted to touch upon those things. I mentioned a video that I was the other day, the Mark Moss video, and he talked about 2 mistakes that China made. The first one, going back to 1873, was talked about how China stayed on the silver standard, which led to a 30% devaluation of its currency, loss of purchasing power, and loss of international influence. And number 2, and I'm concising about an 18-minute video into 30 seconds. But he said in recent years, what they've been accumulating gold, preparing for a gold-backed currency, but and he's a big Bitcoin guy. He says that they've banned Bitcoin and kicked out 60% of the Bitcoin mining operations, which have failed, and they've failed to see a strategic advantage of the digital assets. And essentially, what he's saying is that the United States is going to retain the advantage, because as China retreats from digital innovation, and the United States is embracing Bitcoin and other digital assets, because the public and the private entities are buying and mining it. The political and the financial leaders, Larry Frank, Eric Trump, things like that, they're basically endorsing it, and the U.S. is positioning Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset. So now I'm curious what you guys have to say on that. And that's just a brief summary of what he stated in terms of China making a critical mistake.
Go ahead, Southern.
I always know Trump says things like Panama Canal, Greenland. That's like get China out of our backyard. So I got the Trump speak there. I'm trying to figure out the Fort Knox and why he and Elon haven't brought it up lately about visiting. What is the Trump speak on that?
Stellar, go ahead.
I was going to, as soon as he started bringing up Bitcoin, my thing just totally bombed out and it kicked me out. So sorry about that. Bitcoin cannot sustain, in my opinion, because of the fuel that is used on it. It's good for, at this point, liquidity. It's not something that is compliant in the world as far as like a, it's part of the strategic. But he also said, more than likely he said Cardano, Solana, and some of the other ISOs, which are utilities, and those are based here in the United States. I believe China stopped with any Bitcoin mining a couple of years ago. Yes, they have been purchasing gold. If you go onto the debt clock, you can see how much they have and what they've been purchasing and stuff like that. But countries that use Bitcoin as part of their strategic reserve or whatever, like in South America, they've abandoned it. So I would look the fuel costs with it and stuff like that it's not sustainable.
Stellar,
is that what you're talking about?
Can I say something real quick, Stellar? I agree with you. I'm not a huge Bitcoin guy. I'm just saying I think he's using Bitcoin as I think he's using Bitcoin as talking about like Coca-Cola as soda. So, but I do agree with you. I'm not a Bitcoin guy, but I do think that there are a lot of the digital assets out there, XRP, XLM, things of that nature, Cardano, Solana, things of those. I think they are going to play a pivotal role in the future. And I think China is regressing from them. And I think that was the point that he was trying to make, even though he didn't say it.
Okay, let's get to a
and I think people are used to the name Bitcoin as opposed to XRP. I mean, it's getting more noticeable or whatever. But yes, I do agree with you. He's using it probably more like that. But Bitcoin does have a purpose at this point. It's also the liquidity to the fake USDT. So okay, there you go. Sorry.
That's fine. Let's go to Illini.
So Southern asked an interesting question a moment ago, and I can turn this sort of back to Gladio. Why haven't they audited, Fort Knox? There's a number of different things going, like there's a number of different hints going on. Like one of them was Germany about 10 or 15 years ago asked to get their gold back. After World War II, when during the early Cold War, everybody was worried that the Russians would invade. So a lot of continental Europe shipped their gold bars over to the New York Fed, Fort Knox, and West Point. And we were kind of we were the secure repository of gold. Germany asked for their gold back, about 10 or 15 years ago. And it took a couple of years. And the gold bars that they got back, the numbers didn't match the ones that they originally sent. So that was kind of an interesting development there. And then if you kind of factor into that, Colonel's, prior work, prior review of, Operation Golden Lily, I mean, we don't necessarily know. There's been a lot of secrecy, at Fort Knox since the late 1950s, which I think was when the last audit was done. of the U.S. gold reserves. They did a 1974 tour, I think, and then they did, a recent visit with some photos about, during the first Trump administration. But the irony would be that if we were to actually take a look inside of Fort Knox, and there was too much gold there, and everybody's going to be wondering where it came from. Or, again, the question is, there might not be enough. But the cool thing about gold is it allows us to put a floor on a currency crisis and to help bail out, our fiat currency at a certain point.
So let me address a couple of things that Illini just said. And of course, I got into Golden Lily thanks to War Hamster when he issued a challenge to me after our first Gladio 101 session, all of those months, years ago now. So first of all, there's not ever been an actual audit. The last quote unquote audit that was done, if I recall right, and I do have an article on my Substack because I went back and investigated this after I found out about Golden Lily because my mind was blown. So the last quote unquote audit that was done was Congress saying that we're going to quote unquote audit the gold to shut everybody up. But no one read the fine print in the fact that, if I recall correctly, it was done over a 10-year period in 2-year increments where they only did like a room at a time. So no one has ever seen all of the stated gold in Fort Knox ever, right? And during that quote unquote audit, the pictures that were taken during the fake audit were all black and white. They had colored photos. Why didn't they use them? Because there's a lot of people that believe what they took pictures of to document their fake audit was not actual gold. Because if you take pictures of real gold, it's supposedly very recognizable as real gold as opposed to fake gold. So who knows what's at Fort Knox? Because we have absolutely zero ability to know what is or is not at Fort Knox. Now, as it relates to the gold that was at the Fed in New York, that's a whole nother scandal, because there were documented cases of truckloads of things coming and going out of the New York Fed where the gold depository is. And there was a whole bunch of shenanigans with that as well. Moving on to Golden Lily. Golden Lily, for those of you who are new, is the Japanese going all over the Pacific, both before World War II, but primarily during World War II, and stealing every precious item of any value, to include kitchen sinks, out of every country that they plundered. Korea, Vietnam, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of them. They went to every place and took every diamond, every gold. They knew in China that the families didn't trust the institutions in China and buried their valuables in the backyard. They went into every house they found through the entire area of China. If there was a Japanese soldier on the ground there, they were digging shit up in people's backyard. So all of that was shipped to one of two places. About 10 to 20% estimate that of that total value, about 10 to 20% went to the Bank of Japan, which was owned by the emperor and the emperor's palace. The other 80% went to the Philippines, and they dug 175 sites, big as football fields underground, and buried all of that precious valuables. It was antique scrolls that were thousands of years old. It was libraries. It was everything. So they buried them in these vaults underground. Like I said, some as big as football fields, multiple size football fields. They booby-trapped them all. They dynamited anybody that had worked on them inside of them when they were complete, killed them, so that no one was alive to tell where any of them are. And there were two princes from the Japanese royal family that drew maps and documented them in code. Now, post World War II, they found out about the fact that some stuff was buried there. They didn't know how much or any of that stuff. It's all came out since then. But there was a concerted effort made by a whole bunch of people. And that's the whole reason why you had Marcos there. Marcos was installed in the Philippines because we owned him, and the CIA went in and basically started trying to find the treasure. And they got a guy out of Nevada. We talked about that briefly the other day. They tried to kill him. There's tons of people dead as a result of Golden Lily. They were tortured to death. There were people that were tortured that gave up some of the information, like one of the guys that was a driver, blah, blah, blah. So that gold got shipped all over the world, and it is completely not accountable. No one knows how much that gold was or where it all ended up. We do know that it is on the books of some banks, like Citibank. Citibank, when the guy that was the courier that was taking all of this gold and deciding which bank it went into and how much, and keeping these secret numbered accounts and all this other shit, talking about Switzerland, but a whole bunch of other places, not just Switzerland. When he did that, he got a 10% cut. So he had billions, like 40 billion, more than 40 billion. He had billions and billions of dollars. And his daughter and his accountant went with all of the credentials to get her money out of Citibank. And the next day after stalling her, they shipped it to the Bahamas. So it is still on their books. They're making loans based on that quote unquote asset, but it is not in the New York bank because they moved it. And a lot of this information is out there. So God knows how much gold there is anywhere, because there's a whole bunch of people. Oh, and there was another thing that happened. Japan, when they did get some of the gold out, had a process where they had gold certificates that they set up purposely with typos on it and recorded what the typo was. So anybody that showed up with one of those gold certificates that had a particular typo on it was either killed or arrested for fraud, because they said you were trying to basically like counterfeit a gold certificate, when in fact they were purposely done that way so they could only be redeemed by people on the inside of the scam. So if you're one of the people on the inside of the scam and you wanted to redeem your gold certificate as part of this whole scheme, then they would make phone calls and say, yeah, you can give him his gold, but then somebody else who may have come across one or bartered one or whatever, they show up. They're not supposed to know. They can't have the gold because they're not on the inside, and they would literally kill some of these people. They just show up dead. So the whole thing is a crazy story. So that's my point on the whole gold story. So no one knows, and if they say they know, they don't know, because it's not based on any actual official documentation, because there's never really been an audit of the gold that the US government has.
It's probably in Ukraine. Sorry.
Yeah, it's the whole thing is just crazy. All right. Last chances, anybody? Okay. So we are continuing on tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about an ugly American, a Dutch reporter as an agent of the West in Africa. That's our topic of conversation tomorrow. Okay, thanks everybody for being here. Hopefully we will have a show tomorrow at noon with War Hamster if he's feeling better. And God bless him for coming in and providing his insight. He obviously is a very intelligent guy when it comes to banking, and history and a bunch of other stuff. So we really, really are honored to have him here among us. And Illini as well.
I used to work in dental. Warhamster, warm, damp compresses as well as cold ice. 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off. Go back and forth on each side. The best thing that you can use is like a bag of frozen peas. I used to work in dental. No sucking from a straw.
Okay, guys. Now that you've got your lessons on everything, we will see you guys tomorrow. Take care.
Thank you, Colonel.
Thanks, Southern.
Thank you, all of you.
I cut Stellar off every single time. Dadgummit. Holy crap. Okay. Thanks, guys, for being here. Take care.